So some of you know that UUCA has had a strong tradition of being a teaching congregation, which means we would bring in someone in ministerial formation near the end of that time, and they would work with us, typically full-time for a year, to complete their formation. And I was the intern minister here 12 years ago. And at that time, I lived in that White House that no one ever enters anymore, called the Vaz House, right out that way. And while I was there, I would somewhat guiltily watch a lot of shows on CW. It's true. And my favorite show was called Emily Owens, MD. And there was this one episode where Emily Owens, as a medical resident, delivered a baby. And shortly after this child was delivered, she and the parents recognized that the child was a hermaphrodite, had both female and male genitals. And this is not what the ultrasound had led them to expect. They had planned for a son, they had a name picked out, and a room decorated, and they were like very much in that envisioning stage. And Emily Owens explained that this is something that happens, and she had a recommended course forward. And the father in the episode really resisted. And she honored the fact that he was in a place of real grief. That he had expected and imagined this child who was not the child born to him. And she provided some tender care and some sound medical counseling. And she pointed out that the best way forward in terms of the child's well-being would to be let the child develop naturally over time on their own. To wait before doing any intervention to see if the child expressed any gender identity, identified themselves as a boy or a girl, or perhaps both or neither, before taking any steps. And to take some steps early on might be to make the wrong choice for their child and lead to more psychological and medical needs in the future. And in the end, both parents thought and made a choice. And their choice was to love their child and to support their child. And so they went forward and chose the name Sam as a gender-neutral name and went forward as a family. Now, what struck me was here was this show on a pretty minor network, and it was not a significant show. It got canceled mid-season, first season, right in the middle of this delicious love triangle. I've looked it up just in case I could find a script out there to know what happens, but no. I've had to live with that uncertainty for a dozen years. But I thought, never have I seen an example of someone, of anything, modeling how best to be respectful and supportive and pastoral to a family facing this situation. How best to parent, how best to be a supporting community member. And it made me wonder, if this is how this show is handling it with sensitivity and care and science, how are our churches handling this? And I'll tell you, I had never heard a sermon or a Sunday morning devoted to lifting up transgendered people or their lives in Unitarian Universalism, and a lot has happened in a dozen years. There's been a wonderful shift, and many of our congregations have become way more affirming and welcoming. But today's sermon is really a response to that question. It's about the what and the why and the so what of being and living in a transgender world. But I want to pause here because something happens even in our wonderful UU communities of today where I say, oh, we're going to be doing a Trans 101 class, or we're going to be supporting trans folk in our community. And UUs will say, oh, I am absolutely supportive of anyone marrying whomever they wish. And I say, yes, we love, and we honor choice, and we support mutuality and self-determination, and we believe that what matters is the relationship between people than who those people are and their various identities going into that marriage. And transgender or gender identity and sexual orientation are different things. It's like asking someone, how is your eyesight, but really meaning, how good is your hearing? It's a different question. And I think sometimes we just think, we line up a bunch of letters all together and they're like kind of grouped in the same thing, but each one is actually something distinct and beautiful on its own. And so when people transition or come out as transgender, that may affect their sexual orientation, and often not. So I just want to posit that and put that idea in there for you. But I will tell you observationally, this is not scientific. This is just Reverend Anastasia. That I notice that transgender people tend to choose to be in relationships, intimate relationships, with people who are radically authentic and radically accepting, period. And don't we want to be more like that ourselves? Yes. So, what is transgender? And to get to what is transgender, I have to quickly run through a couple other definitions. First, what is sex? And I don't mean the good kind. So, what is sex is your atomical, biological, physiological presentation, i.e. kind of what does your body look like? That causes one to assign a certain sex, often male or female, to oneself or to another. What is gender? Gender are the societal norms and roles we play that are meant to indicate to others often what our sex is, right? Those things are often linked, but aren't so linked anymore. In fact, we used to say that people were gender transgressive. Now we just kind of shift and we say, there's a lot of different ways and norms and people are gender breaking and all those sort of things. But let me just give an example, because things really, as much as things have changed, things have remained the same. So, I think I present pretty female. I'm wearing this thing I call a dress, but it's like a one-piece outfit with a loose piece of clothing with, that goes around. In other cultures, men wear a similar garb in hot weather places. That's traditional wear that men have. And I don't fit all gender stereotypes either. So one that I like to think of as perhaps my most gender breaking is I became a member of the clergy. Only 8% of clergy members in the United States are female. Yes, Jen, exactly. And so there was this one time I went to this community meeting that was for clergy who work, meeting with the police in Indianapolis to try to figure out how we could work together to do community policing and reduce police violence. And I sat there and I was pretty much ignored by the other people at the table who were talking to each other. And then one turns to me and he says, "So whom are you here with?" And I said, actually I'm the minister at the Unitarian Church. And he goes, "You run the children's programs?" And I go, "No, I'm the minister." And he goes, "With your husband?" And I said, "No, I'm the only minister there." And he goes, "Huh." And then he turns back and his wife looks at me and she goes, "I work at the church too." Now you would think that this is an other people problem, but I would say that a few years ago, there was a beloved member here in leadership, did anti-racism work, and she looked me right in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry, I was raised Catholic, but I could just never accept a woman as a clergy person." There are ways that our notions of gender are so deeply within us that we are still struggling for our liberation, even here. Thank you. So, then there's gender identity. And gender identity is what you know about yourself, what you articulate to yourself about who you are and your gender. And that can be that you're a woman, a man. It could be that you're gender queer. It could be that you are gender fluid. There's a whole lot of things, but it's the story you tell yourself. So what is it to be transgender? Transgender is any time when the identity that you know yourself as and your gender does not align with the sex that you have been assigned. When there's a contrast there. So a transgender person, and I use transgender intentionally, it's a huge umbrella term. It encapsulates a lot, so it's a pretty safe use term if you are not keeping current with the variety of new language that is emerging. You can still use transgender. And transgender can be anyone from someone who presents male but knows themselves as female, or presents female and knows themselves as male. It could be someone who has retained their body but chooses to present in a gender that's not aligned with their sexual organs or physiology. It could be someone who's decided to undergo hormone and surgery so that way their body matches their gender identity. It could be someone who's gender fluid, little male, little female, some days more than others, either direction. It could be someone who's gender queer who goes, what I am does not fit in either bucket. It's not here or there or yes, and it is something distinct and beautiful in itself. And there's more. And there's more. So in short, and I'd say we live in a world which is diverse in its trans expressionism and diverse in the way that we're pushing and breaking gender norms. Some of my queer friends says that to be queer means to push back against either or, male, female, black, white thinking, and to embrace a yes and a becoming and a rainbow of vitality. Amen. Amen. And there are all ways that I hope and kind of come to know that Unitarian Universalists are queer in that way. So it's a really interesting question. There are wondrous trans folk here in our world, and we live in this wondrous queer world. And why? Why is that? Now, there are different theories. The predominant theory in the 20th century, and still too common today, is that this was rooted in some point of psychological trauma or harm. And literally the theory went, people were trans because they probably had a smothering mother and a distant father. And if that was true, there would be way more trans people. Just saying. But in recent decades, geneticists have been looking literally more deeply for some answers. And one of the earliest clues was there was this group of women. They had female anatomy, they identified as women, they presented themselves as women, and yet when it came time to give birth, they were experiencing reproductive loss. And when the doctors went in, they were like, there's something, your reproductive organs just aren't functioning quite right. And they did a deeper dive, and they realized, and by the way, I should have paid more attention to what a chromosome is versus what a gene is in 9th grade biology. But they found that there is this gene that was mutated a little. And this gene is a very important gene for our discussion today. It is the SYR gene, SYR. And there's a geneticist, Siddhartha Mukherjee, and he says in his metaphors, the SYR gene is like a light switch. When it's switched on, you're male, and when it's switched off, you're female. On, off. And these women, who became known as the Sawyer women, or having Sawyer's syndrome, their SYR gene was mutated. So it flipped, but it didn't read flipped. And the SYR gene is like a commander gene. And when it's flipped on, it starts kind of yelling out to the other genes as you're developing in, I guess as a fetus. And it's saying, turn male, turn male, turn male. It's meant to cascade all these other genes to turn male. And because it was mutated, those people with the Sawyer syndrome didn't get the message. So they had an XY chromosome, but they didn't switch over. Now, I want you to think about this. So there's this one gene, the master gene, that's saying, turn male, and then there's all these genes that are meant to follow suit. And yet, there are these genes that I call UU genes, highly resistant to authority. And some of them go, I don't think so. No honey cakes, that ain't me. So I think about, have you guys ever been to an arcade? Oh yeah, So there are these ones where like, you kind of shoot this ball up and it like ping, 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 ping. And like, there are these like big butt cups and they're like these little cups at the bottom and they have these like ticket things at the bend and like, there are big ones that are like 20 and 20. Plinko? So appreciative. So Plinko. And then there's like one in the center, it's like 1,000 tickets, right? And the pegs are designed that almost nothing ends up there, or in the 500 or the 250 or the 750, just saying. But if the ball in Plinko was to go down and just hit one of those pegs at a certain angle with a certain velocity, it could end up there. So the way to understand SYR and its corresponding, sometimes mutinous genes is that every year there are millions of people for whom in their bodies and in their genes, the SYR and all the little subgenes are not aligned. And I want you to think about this. Some might say yes, some might say no. It's not like there is just one way to be transgender genetically. There are so many ways, many of which we don't understand. And some of them might affect how our brain thinks and develops. Some of them might affect our level of bone strength or body. Some affect hair growth, voice. There could be so many different parts. It is wondrous to live in such a diverse trans world. And, lots of yes and. As Alex Capitan wrote in the reading that Reverend John read earlier, sure, there's biology, and there is certainly a choice. There are many choices about how to express yourself. As someone who loves, as someone who lives, as someone who delights, as someone who insists. And we should all be choosing ways that help us be more vibrant. Now, the part of trans identity that gets the most attention is whether or not someone is going from outside the trans community, not inside the trans community, but outside. It's like, okay, well, here's a trans person. Are they going to change themselves? I do hormones and surgery to then become the gender they feel inside? And I'll tell you, less than half of the trans community is interested in going that route, period. Some of the people who are in that minority choose to do hormones. A fewer choose surgery. Some will choose the top surgery, and even fewer will choose the bottom surgery. Because, and the ones who do, one thing is, that's something that they know is really true for themselves, and they have access to medical care that is not easy to find and is highly expensive because it's not insured. But the reason why many don't choose it is because they know themselves and accept themselves and whom they are as a natural and blessed and wondrous and, like everyone, imperfect person. And so they choose to be who they are and accept themselves. And we also, all of us, have a choice about whether or not and how we are going to be with the transgender community. So 88% of school-age kids, 5 through 12th, kindergarten through 12th grade, who are trans, report bullying. 12% are sexually assaulted. Trans people have twice as high as typical unemployment rates, have trouble finding apartments and housing. The most recent data I've shown is that 41% of trans individuals will end up attempting or taking their life. And yet, when asked what is the number one thing that they want, community and acceptance. And they don't mean like tolerance or getting all the pronouns right or like having lots of rainbow things even though they're fabulous. It means radical inclusion. It means a community where they could come as they are, with all parts of themselves. Their gender expression, their relationships, their taste in music, their dance style, their dress, and they want that for you too. So we all have a choice. We all have a choice. And my dear ones, I hope that we recognize that we live in a beautiful, blessed, diverse, queer, rainbow, trans world. And may we recognize that we have a choice in creating a beloved community where what we put first is our love for one another. May that world be a safer and more holy place. May it be so because we make it so. And amen.